Good afternoon, everybody. We'll get started in just a couple minutes here. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. Like with all of our things, especially when we do them on Zoom, we have a little bit of housekeeping we're going to do in the beginning and then after that, we'll get on with the main reason that we're all here. So again, good afternoon. I guess it's afternoon. Yeah. So thank you for participating in our hybrid meeting today for the MATES Technical Advisory Group here for the South Coast AQMD. We have three formats for participation: in person, Zoom, and teleconference. In-person attendees must not connect to the Zoom application or teleconference while on the meeting. We ask that you silence your other communication devices to prevent disruptions during the meeting. For those in the room as well, you can get agendas and slides over there on the table. And in case of any evacuation of earthquake or something like that, we can get into the tables nice and sturdy. We have doors to the right and over to my left as well. Bathrooms are also off just to the left, just outside. For those who are on Zoom, everybody will be placed on mute by the host unless you are a panelist. You will not be able to mute or unmute your line manually unless you are a panelist. For public comment, I think we're going to try to run the format for this technical advisory group the same way that we did our last one, where we are going to limit the discussion on each agenda item to the technical advisory group itself. But the public comment, we're going to push all of that to the very end of the meeting. And we want to definitely encourage public discussion, but we're going to try to do it at that last item. For those on Zoom, if you would like to make public comment on the Zoom screen, please click on the raise hand button. For those calling in by phone, you can dial *9 to signal you would like to comment. Your name or part of your phone number will be called when it is your turn to comment, and the host will unmute your line automatically. Please note you can hang up and/or leave the Zoom meeting at any time. Of course, please treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being dropped from the meeting. Lastly, please be aware that this video conference meeting is being recorded. By participating in this meeting hosted by South Coast AQMD, you agree to authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD. I see right now staff is pulling in technical advisory group members from the Zoom attendees to the panelists. If there are any tag members who want to be brought over to the panel or that hasn't been done so yet, feel free to raise your hand. In addition, if there are any board members or board member consultants who would like to be brought over onto the panel, please raise your hand and we will bring you over. Okay, that's all the boring stuff. So welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Ian Macmillan. I am the Assistant Deputy Executive Officer for the Planning, Rule Development, and Implementation Division. Happy to be with you all today. I do see Sarah Reese, my boss, is on for the intro, but you have to listen to me first. She's stuck in a plane. Her flight was canceled, so a little late, but I know we have a very good agenda here today. It was a very good discussion last time. Really appreciate all the feedback we got. It's sparked a whole series of very interesting conversations internally as well, as we've taken that feedback and really started to plan out how we're going to conduct this next generation of mates. So with that, I think we're just going to go ahead and get going with the presentations themselves. We have 3 of them lined up. So we're going to go to the first one on brake, tire wear, and road dust emission health risk study. And Nico, do you want to take us away? Actually, I'm going to say one more point. I apologize. Last time we did do introductions for everybody at the very beginning. We've got a lot of people here. I don't think we need to do introductions every time. But if you do have a comment or you want to have a question or anything, if you could just say who you are, where you're from, the first time you say something, I think that'd be helpful, just so everybody remembers. All right, thanks. Go ahead, Nico.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nico Schulte. I'm an air quality specialist at South Coast AQMD. So this presentation, or this part of the presentation, is going to describe the, do you want to pull up the slide? Okay. So this part of the presentation is going to cover the MATE 6 tire wear, brake wear, and road dust health emission and health risk study. So the slides are going to cover the draft request for proposals that we're developing, including the objectives, the tasks, the scoring criteria to evaluate proposals, and the timeline for that work. So I'm going to call this study the brake and tire wear study throughout this presentation. Okay, so before starting, I want to review the goals of MATES. So these are to provide information about health risks from air toxics throughout South Coast AQMD jurisdiction, to track progress in reducing exposure to air toxics, and to provide direction to future toxic control programs. So some of the outcomes of MATES include the air toxic health risk assessment, interactive data visualization, and the analysis of concentration trends. And so the brake and tire wear study will provide data necessary to begin to understand the current risks of brake and tire wear particles and to inform these types of data specifically for brake and tire wear particles. Next slide. The focus of the brake and tire wear study is to study brake wear particles and tire and road wear particles. So it's important for risk assessments to study the combination of tire and road wear particles rather than tire wear particles alone. This is because the tire tread particles become mixed with road wear particles when they're emitted due to interaction of the tires with the road surface. So as an example, the picture on the right sort of an example of this. It shows road wear particles mixed with tire tread particles internally. And so it's difficult to separate this and difficult to separate the health risks due to exposure to these different components of tire and road wear particles. So we think it's useful for this study to analyze that as one substance. Additionally, these particles, the brake wear particles and tire and road wear particles, are becoming a larger fraction of vehicle-related toxic emissions because exhaust emissions have decreased over time. So as an example of this, the picture on the left shows PM10 emissions for South Coast AQMD calculated using MFAC. It demonstrates the reduced exhaust emissions over time, and also that we predict that emissions from brake wear and tire wear are going to continue to increase over time. So these are going to become a larger fraction of the total PM emissions from vehicle-related PM emissions. It's also important for risk assessment to consider the direct and the resuspended particles together. So many of the particles emitted from brake and tire wear will become deposited on the road surface, and they can become resuspended by passing vehicles. The resuspended particles can make up about 50% of the total PM10 brake wear particles and tire and road wear particles. So they're an important component of the total health risk due to those emissions. Next slide. So this is just an overview of the brake and tire wear health risk study. South Coast AQMD will contract out this study due to limited staff experience with this type of health risk assessment. We're providing up to $850,000 funding. AQMD staff will support sample collection, modeling, and measurements and analysis as resources allow. And in developing the study, the contractor will design methods for exposure assessment and risk calculation, and will coordinate with the MATE 6 study and the South Coast AQMD staff to conduct the sampling, measurements, modeling, and analysis to estimate health risks due to brake wear particles and tire and road wear particles. So we're seeking feedback from the technical advisory group on the draft RFP, and I'll go over the details of those in the next slides. Next slide, please. Just some context for the type of typical concentration levels of brake wear particles and tire and road wear particles that have been observed in South Coast AQMD. So this data is from a CARB-funded research study that used chemical mass balance modeling based on measurements collected in Anaheim and Long Beach. So the table on the right shows data from 4 CMB profiles that the study used. Road dust makes up the bulk of the PM10 that they observed. Brake and tire wear both make up like 1 to 2 or a few microgram per meter cubed concentrations on average. So some downsides of this study and other past studies is that uncertainties, or in this case, the standard errors of these concentrations are relatively large. So we think it's difficult to use these for health risk calculations or model evaluations. So it's important for the brake and tire study that the contractor develops performance metrics and targets for both measured and modeled data to improve our understanding of the concentrations, such as, for example, developing targets for measurement accuracy and precision, or other metrics for model data that we can use to improve the exposure estimates. Next slide. So this covers the main objectives of the brake and tire research study. Objective 1 is to estimate the brake wear particle and tire and road wear particle concentrations throughout the South Coast AQMD jurisdiction during MATE 6. For this objective, the contractor should use methods that quantify the contribution of brake wear particles and tire and road wear particles without interference from other road dust or other interfering sources. They should also, the second objective is to estimate the health risks due to breakaway particles and tire and roadwear particles. This study in particular will focus on the cancer risk and the non-cancer chronic health risks. As part of this, the contractor should use parts of the OEA health risk assessment procedures when possible, although they do not need to rely on standard risk factors developed by OEA. Next slide. So it's important for the study to address the parts of health risk assessment. So this slide covers the main parts of the OHIA risk assessment guidelines. The first step in these guidelines is hazard identification, which is to identify the pollutants or substances contributing to risk. Next is exposure assessment, which uses model data or measurement data to estimate concentrations that the population is exposed to. Third is dose response assessment, which develops cancer potency factors or non-cancer RELs, or other methods that can be used to estimate risk. And finally is risk characterization. In this step, all these factors are combined. So the cancer potency factors, for example, are combined with exposure assessments and information about exposure pathways by which the population can be exposed to estimate total risks due to that exposure. Additionally, for MATES, if this is a priority in future MATE studies or in other future studies, we may analyze concentration trends and track risks through the future. Next slide. So this goes over kind of the main tasks that are part of the draft scope of work for the request for proposals, the draft request for proposals. The first is a literature review to identify pollutants that may contribute to cancer risk and non-cancer chronic health risks. The second is to develop the method to estimate exposures to breakaway particles and tire and roadwear particles. This should include a test to see a pilot study to see how well those exposure estimates perform for this application. Third is to estimate cancer risk and non-cancer chronic health risks. And third is to develop methods to estimate those risks. And fourth is to conduct the measurement, the modeling analysis to achieve these objectives in conjunction with MATE 6 and in coordination with South Coast AQMD staff. Next slide. So for task one, the contractor will develop criteria to screen pollutants based on risk. So many of the substances that are part of breakaway particles and tire and roadwear particles don't have known risk factors, such as those developed by OEA. And so the contractor doesn't need to rely on those types of risk factors, and they can, identify other factors that could be used as a screening method for these substances. They should conduct a literature review to identify those risk factors and potential exposure pathways for the pollutants, and look at other types of data such as scientific data, manufacturer data, emissions data, and any other data that can be useful for this application. So they will provide to us, this list of pollutants, their associated risk screening criteria, and other health data that's relevant for estimating health risks. Next slide. Task 2 is to develop the method to estimate exposures. So for this, the contractor will design the measurement, modeling, and analysis methods to quantify the outdoor concentrations of breakaway particle and tire and roadwear particles. Like I mentioned before, this method should sort of prevent interference from other sources, such as other road dust that's not from breakaway particles and tire and roadwear particles. Must be applicable over the entire jurisdiction. This should resolve hotspots and spatial trends. This implies a resolution of approximately 2-kilometer resolution for the exposure estimates. And the contractor should work with AQMD staff to determine what type of support, for example, for sampling or modeling, that AQMD staff will provide during the study. Next, they're going to conduct a pilot study to help evaluate the performance of this method for application in MATE 6. So for this, the contractor should develop targets for model performance or targets for performance of the measurements, and then also assess whether this can be useful for the exposure estimates. So they will deliver to us, the method design, results of the pilot study in a progress report, and then also in the final report. And they will provide to us training to be able to conduct the parts of this study that is supported by South Coast AQMD staff. Next slide. So task 3 is to develop the method to estimate the cancer and non-cancer chronic health risks. So for this part, the contractor will develop those analysis methods and provide them to us in a final report. And they will also provide training to South Coast AQMD staff to conduct whatever parts of this analysis method will be implemented by or supported by South Coast AQMD staff. Next slide. Okay, task 4 is really the core of what we're asking for here. So this is to actually conduct the measurement, modeling, and analysis to estimate exposure and risk for MATE 6. So in coordination with AQMD staff and the MATE 6 measurement and modeling phases, the contractor will conduct whatever sampling, measurements, modeling, and analysis necessary to implement the methods developed for task 2 and 3 to estimate exposure and the cancer and non-cancer chronic health risks for MATE 6. So again, AQMD staff can support parts of this as resources allow. We suggest that AQMD staff can provide better support if these methods for task 2 and task 3 are developed early in the planning process. The deliverables will be the exposure and health risk assessments in a progress report and in the final report. Next slide. So that covers kind of the core tasks that we plan to specify or that are specified in the draft RFP. These next slides go over the scoring criteria, which will be used to evaluate proposals that are submitted as part of in response to the RFP. So this is outlined here. The first is understanding of the requirements, which is 20 points. The technical and management approach. So this would be like meeting the requirements that we specify, including the spatial resolution, the ability to quantify the compounds of interest, and other technical requirements, which is also 20 points. Additional 20 points is the qualifications of the contractor for completing this type of work. 30 points is for previous experience on similar type of projects. And then finally, 10 points based on the cost that's proposed in the proposal. Additionally, additional points will be awarded based on the procurement policy from AQMD, for example, for small businesses and for other types of additional points. Next slide. This is the tentative timeline for releasing the notice inviting proposals through to the final completion of the study. So we plan to release the RFP and the notice inviting proposals on February 2nd. Proposals will be due on May 2nd, so that leaves about 90 days for contractors to develop the proposals. We anticipate that the board will approve the selected contractor on August 2nd, and contract execution is anticipated for August 16th. So the MATE 6 measurement phase begins in early 2025. So this is kind of a critical part of the timeline because Task 4 of this RFP and onward will be conducted in conjunction with that measurement phase and the modeling phases in MATES. So task 1 and task 2 are due in February 2025. Task 3 would be due in May 2025. And then finally, task 4 would be due in August 2027. And this is the sort of the final exposure and risk estimates from task 4. And then a final report would be due in February 2028. Next slide. So we have some topics for discussion that we would like feedback, from the TAG about regarding the study. So first, are the objectives and tasks that we've listed appropriate for a first study of breakware particles and tire and roadwear particles in MATES? Okay. Yeah, are the research tasks and South Coast AQMD measurements the research task that we focus on will focus on the roadway emitted breakware and tire and roadwear particles. So should other sources, such as, for example, airports, be specified or should be studied as part of the request for proposals? Is the scope of work reasonable with the allocated funding and the timeline? Any other tasks that we should specify? Is the 90 days that we've allocated for developing proposals sufficient? And is there enough time included in the timeline to conduct the test 1 and 2 before starting the MATES measurement phase, which, the measurement phase will begin in early 2025. And any other feedback from the TAG is also appreciated.
Okay, thank you, Nico. So, we have these questions here. We'll leave those up on screen for just now. Other questions that come up that anybody has, feel free to ask them or any comments. One of the things that I do want to highlight that Nico was talking about at the end is this is a fairly quick turnaround as far as getting this RFP out through government procedures. And so we're trying to get this out in time to get relevant data that we need. And so there's this balancing act of how much can we put in the scope, how much can people do and on what timeline. So any thoughts on any of that would be helpful, as well as just the general scope of this. So I'm going to open this up now to anyone who has any thoughts or questions or comments. This is definitely informed by what we heard in the last conversation, as well as, our heart isn't 100% set on where we are right now. We want to hear from everybody, who has thoughts now. So I'll start in the room. Looks like you wanted to.
I do. Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Afif El Hassan. I'm a pediatrician, asthma specialist, and I'm a board member of the American Lung Association. So before coming to the meeting today, and by the way, thank you very much for this excellent proposal and presentation. First of all, interestingly enough, I did a literature search and I could not find too much out there about tire debris at all, which was interesting. What makes it even more interesting is that tire debris is one of the more indestructible particles that we take into our body versus everything else. And another problem being that the size of the particle can be either large, 10 micron or larger, and then we could just expel that through the upper airway defenses, or it can be much smaller and get in far deeper and cause other problems. And quite frankly, we don't know what it does. I just can't find the literature unless you know of some literature. If you do, please let me know, because I looked extensively for it. I appreciate the study. I appreciate the approach that you're taking. The only comment I would make with this is I have a lot of different questions about it. First of all, what does the body physiologically do with these particles? What does it do in the upper airway and lower airway? Does the size of the particle matter, and do we need to measure that? And, versus one. Also, what's on those particles besides debris? This is a inert, a tiny microscopic piece of rubber is an inert. substance, which probably can hold a lot of things on it. And I'm not sure what kind of chemicals would be attracted to it, but that could be a problem as well, because it could be a delivery. It could be a delivery. It could nuke, for lack of a better word, nuke our bodies by holding on to something else and causing even more damage. So I have a lot of questions regarding the reaction of the body, the size of the particle. Are we going to differentiate between the different sizes of particles and what we are exposed to versus what's washed away or blown away? What is each particle? How far does it go once it's been shed? So I'd be very interested in that. And I think, I'm not sure $850,000 is enough, but I know money is a limit, but I think there are both medical and chemical knowledge that we have to get on these particles that, quite frankly, I haven't found in the literature. So I commend what you're doing, and I'm happy that we're addressing it, because unless you have a source that I can't find, there's no great information on this or what it does to us. So I appreciate that, and obviously, like everyone else, I'm going to be very interested in the outcomes.
Yeah, good questions. Maybe I'll start and then I'll turn over and see if anybody else wants to add in some thoughts. So good questions. Obviously, you're asking a lot of questions. We have a lot of questions as well. I mean, I think that's the idea that there's a lot that needs to be known about this field. I think you're hitting on it. The one thing I did want to note is, I think your first question was asking, what does the body do with these, this material once it's inside of it? And typically, I think how our MATE studies have worked is we tend to focus less on the toxicological aspect to it. That is really kind of more assigned to other agencies like US EPA, Cal EPA under OEHA. They're the ones that do that basic toxicological research. We can do more of the exposure, the composition of what's in the air, that sort of thing. But determining how toxic is a substance to the body, that tends to sort of fall outside of our scope. Not saying it's not an important question. It just traditionally kind of have to draw a balance somewhere. That's one that I think we traditionally do. But I know there's a number of other questions that I think we have similar questions, but I don't know if anybody else here wants to weigh in on any of that.
So our strategy is kind of going to be mainly more like on a component by component basis, much like the rest of MATES. I mean, we do have an aggregate diesel particulate matter factor that we use when we're assessing health risk in MATES. But at least with brake and tire, where we're probably headed towards identifying some key toxic species in them, and then using a similar approach like with the OEHA risk factors that we have, where like each species has its own risk factor. We know there's probably some synergistic effects, right? And there are some issues based on particle size, right? But the OEHA approach doesn't really consider that as much, and I think that's probably a good first cut at least. But like you said, like we realize the same thing, that this field is pretty immature, compared to looking at diesel, for example. So there's a lot more of that base level research that needs to be done.
Yeah, please.
Oh, that's very loud. Excuse me. I had similar questions, but maybe I can build off of those questions. One question was whether there would be size resolved composition measurements, and given what he was saying and what we know about the importance of size in penetration of these particles, might that be an objective, or at least maybe you could give more points to proposals that have size resolved chemical composition, and in parallel consider size distribution measurements to the extent that you could determine if there are key profiles for size distributions for brakes, which I think probably would be smaller particles, and then road dust, which should be larger ones. So I think paying attention to size is important as we generate new information in an open field. And then another question I had was about back on the rubric. There's a note, I think it's in the second item of the rubric, about the highest risk compounds, studies that giving some points to studies that could target the highest risk. That one, yeah. And I guess I was under the impression from the previous slides that we don't actually know what the highest risk compounds are, or maybe this is based on the information you already have, but it seemed like might be a little circular in that this study will help identify some of those high risk compounds. And so what assumptions are you making in awarding points or favorability to certain proposals based on incomplete information? Because there isn't much known yet. And there was a third question, which was generally about the timeline between the proposals being received, chosen, and then executing the deployment during the measurement campaign. And I don't have a sense of how far apart we are from where you want to be and what the state of the measurement science is. But if we are quite far apart in that a contractor will have to develop a method and not just execute a method that they've already got at hand, then I don't know if that's enough time. But if there are folks who are ready to make the measurements that will achieve the goals, then I think the timeline is fine. But if you're asking people to develop new methods, I don't know. I'm very slow, so it wouldn't be enough time for me. Don't vote for me, but it may be tough. Thank you.
Great points, good questions. Anybody have any thoughts? I think just good things that we can take back, but not seeing any. Sure.
This is Payam Pakrin. I'm with the air monitoring team. So beyond this contract, we're also doing our own air measurements, and that includes not the size distribution, but we have CPCs at all of the 10 major sites of the mates. So like that measures total number concentration, knowing that 90-something% of it is dominated by PM1. So like we usually interpret that as the ultrafine particles. And then we have continuous measurements of PM2.5 mass and PM10 mass, and that includes both of how the particles are distributed in different sizes. And that also includes the speciation that we're doing. We're doing that on PM2.5 and PM10, and I will cover a little bit more details on that as part of the next presentation on source apportion.
Please.
Don Collins from University of California, Riverside. And I had a quick question and then a comment. The question is, when you describe exposure to particulate matter from tire wear and brake wear, whether that will also include secondary particulate matter from gaseous emissions from those sources. The comment is, and maybe this is something that you've already thought about, and I don't know whether it makes sense to incorporate it into this project or to maybe handle it internally, but when you showed in one of the very early slides the trends in tailpipe emissions versus brake wear and tire wear, it's clear that this is a very large fraction of overall vehicle emissions now. And I think it would be useful to have an element where you can quantify the black carbon the contribution of these emissions to measured black carbon, because I think that if you don't do that, you may in a sense be double counting. You're going to infer your diesel particulate matter concentration from black carbon concentrations measured with an ethylometer. And if these are contributing significantly, in part because the emissions overall are so large, then that could be a large fraction. And without accounting for that, you're going to overestimate your diesel particulate matter. I don't know how much work has been done on the black carbon, on the influence of these emissions on black carbon concentrations on measurements. But I mean, there's carbon black in tires, and so it's certainly non-zero. And with such a large concentration, it may be pretty significant and probably increasingly so in the future.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I'm also thinking about the distance component related to that of, exhaust versus brake wear, tire wear, and what does that distance profile look? That's probably pretty different between the two, I'd imagine. So a lot of curves overlapping there. Interesting. Okay. I'm gonna turn to, I see there's a bunch of hands on Zoom, which is good. I'm just, a quick note, I see a few questions in the Q&A. We'll open it up to the public on all the agenda items at the very end. But if you have questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A itself. Also, if people were looking for the slides, that's actually in the Q&A. The link is there in the slides. You can also find it on our website. Okay, with that, I see we have some people that have been waiting patiently. So Joe Kay, I think you're up first.
Hi, thank you. Joe Kay Ghosh, I'm Director of Research and Evaluation at Luna Health. So I had largely, well, so one comment. I think this is I'm really.
But we
Hello?
can't.
Oh, you can't hear me. Hold on one second.
Joe Kay, you there?
Yep. Can you hear me now?
Tell you what, we'll come back to you. We'll keep going.
Just to note that we can hear her well online, so it's something in the room. If you're not hearing her there.
Yeah, we're hearing her fine.
Give us 1 second here. Do we have I'm wondering if we have a volume. Is there? Give us 1 second internally.
Okay. I mean, I can put my comments in the Q&A, I guess, if that helps.
In the room, currently we're having a hard time with audio.
I'm unmuted. Let's see.
Let's see. Apologize, just a
No, that's just you.
the technical issue here.
And we're unmuted on both PCs.
Is that?
It would be on her end. Yeah, that one's open. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if anybody has questions that they wanted to pop in the Q&A, feel free to do that as we try to work on the room here. Apologize for this. Okay, let's try one more time. Bill Hopke are you able to unmute and ask a question?
I can certainly try.
Hey, there we are.
You
We can
go?
hear you now in the room. Lovely. Go ahead.
Okay, this is a very ambitious RFP for both time and funding, particularly time. I mean, particularly after the presentation at the last meeting, where what I had thought was a well-established tracer for tire particles, the presenter made a clear case that it was pretty variable and it really wasn't a quantitative tracer for total tire particle mass. So, it's not clear to me that as was discussed earlier, the methodology is already on the shelf, ready to go. So getting this all together in this amount of time is going to be very tricky. So, obviously it's going to take somebody who's got a lot of experience already doing this to be effective in getting this done in time. But I suspect that once you look at these proposals, there may need to be some adjustments.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that feedback. Joe Kay, I just realized I skipped over you. Let's circle back. Do you want to unmute?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry, I was just starting to type up an email. Okay, so really, I just have sort of an administrative comment, which is that I understand that the scoring criteria are sort of the typical scoring criteria that you have, but it's not it's not very well suited for scoring a research proposal. So, for example, of the 100 points, only 20 points are allocated towards scoring the methodological approach, and it seems like that should be the most important component, right, of the score, the most important piece of the score. So if there's any room to make adjustments, I would recommend allocating a larger percentage of the points toward scoring the methodological approach.
Good feedback. Appreciate it. Feng Zhu.
Hi. Can
Hi,
you hear me? Hi, this is Yifeng Zhu from UCLA. First of all, I want to echo what Phil just mentioned. I think the scope of work really depends on what South Coast is trying to get out of this study. If the goal is to use existing knowledge and emission inventory data and try to develop some brake and tire wear surfaces and maps using the current tracers and the existing emission inventories in CARB's database, and then do modeling and then translate that into some health risks, then I think the scope and timeline is reasonable. But if on the other hand, if this is really pushing for new research, new fundings, given people discuss there's a lot of unknowns and limited research in this whole space, then I think it's really challenging to do all of that given the time and funding that is discussed today. Just to give you more concrete aspect examples, if we think about like someone wants to propose something to respond to this, one way to do is can focus on near roadways because that's where the majority of the brake and tire wear particles are, and the literature suggests they're bigger, they're settling quicker, they have like sharper spatial profile near roadway, so it makes sense to do a near roadway study. But that not necessarily translate into what my understanding like Maze wants to do is the exposure surface for the whole Southern California area, South Coast jurisdiction. But to do that, if you want to do a more surface modeling exercise, then that's just a little bit different story, right? Then the airports and other sources, and even the methodologies will be very different. So I think in my mind, I think maybe the district can think about what is the most helpful results, deliverables, and outcomes that could really help Maze. If I understand this is really trying to support the Maze as a whole, could be most useful. Knowing there's many other agencies and other entities are also pushing forward brake and tire research. So I think that's maybe just something to think about. And if you know, as much as we can make the deliverables expectations more clearly articulated in the RFA, I think you will get better responses out of it. Thank you.
Yeah, really good feedback. Appreciate it. And to one of your points there too about other agencies doing research in this field, if there are other efforts underway that anybody knows about, please feel free to send it to us. We don't want to duplicate. I don't think anybody would like that as an outcome of this. But yeah, really good feedback. Appreciate it. Michael Jarrett.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with my colleagues that this is really ambitious for the amount of money that's available and the time. So I think it's important for you to try to hone in on what you really want out of this study and what's going to be most important for informing, mates and looking at trends into the future. I think that, one thing that wasn't clear to me is to what extent you want people to go out in the field and identify new markers of brake and tire wear, or do you want them to just measure what's considered to be, existing measures as imperfect as they are? So that's something that I would make clear. I think if you're trying to develop new markers, there's not probably enough time and money to do that, in addition to everything else that you're looking to get out of this. I think when you get to other sources, and the sort of spatially extensive modeling that Yifangs, you and I and others at UCLA have done with Brake and Jamie Shower's lab was instrumental in analyzing the particles. Certainly the railways are very big predictors of the metal concentrations. So we didn't see that much from airports. We weren't set up to do that in our study, but definitely railways really, come out as a major source of metals. So you probably need to consider that as well if you're trying to get at the issue of particles. And then, when we get to sort of the spatial modeling, if your intent is to develop models that are based solely on the MATES network, it's not really a network, I don't think, that's designed to support that kind of exposure modeling, because it doesn't have a very expansive spatial coverage. And we've got 16, 17 sites, if I recall correctly. And a lot of them are arrayed north to south. So they're not well situated to inform an exposure model. So that's another limitation I think you have to take into account with what you're asking for. And then I think, getting to the health risk assessment, because these particles probably have different physical and chemical properties, they tend to be, for the most part, primary, although as some of our colleagues have pointed out, there's certainly a possibility of secondary formation too, but they are going to cluster much more closely to roadways and areas of dense traffic and heavy duty vehicles. So the question of whether or not there's going to be the same kind of indoor penetration of these particles into residential areas as others that are more homogeneously distributed throughout the region, that's not resolved in the literature. And I don't think that, I haven't seen any really good studies where they've looked at the indoor-outdoor penetrance and what affects that. And then for, a lot of these particles, the metals, there's not a huge database on which to base the risk assessment. So the primary epidemiology, dose response functions, or the toxicology is still quite formative. So again, you're going to have to target that, I think, and look at what kind of risks you're really interested in, doing cancer, non-cancer. It's laudable, but whether or not there's enough there. And certainly we've got some dose response functions that show, adverse birth outcomes. But I think when you start digging into the literature, you're going to see that a lot of these contaminants are not very well characterized. So those are just some thoughts that I had.
Great, thank you very much. Again, a lot to chew on. Not seeing anyone here responding, but I think those are good thoughts. Let's go ahead and keep going. Roya Bahrani.
Yes, hi. Roy Bahrani from UC Riverside. Just a few comments, I think, going back to the comment on size distribution, not just that information would be important for penetration in terms of human health, but also in terms of distribution of particles, how far from roadways they would travel, how efficiently they would be deposited out. I think some information about size of these road wear and tire wear particles would be interesting to have. That said, I also want to add that a group of us from UCR and California Sea Grant and UCI are proposing a project to NOAA. NOAA has a call on, I'm so sorry. NOAA has a call on characterizing microplastics coming from tire and road wear particles, and we're hoping to actually be able to collaborate with AQMD and collect some samples at some of your stations. And if it gets funded, we're going to have some size selected composition on these. The chemical analysis would not be done at UCR, would be done from somewhere in Virginia, a faculty that just left NIST for doing the analysis there. But it's something that if it gets funding, it would be very complementary to this RFP. I agree that I think the timeline and the funding for all that is included in the scope is limited, but hopefully you'll have some applicants that have done this before, and it would be sort of, they would be hitting the ground running. Otherwise, it's very ambitious. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Let's see here, James Shower.
Yeah, so I'm Jamie Shawar from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I don't want to repeat things that have already been said, so I have lots of good comments, and I do appreciate sort of the framing of this and trying to make sure it doesn't, although it's ambitious, there are some things that done in the framing that I think are good, not to get this too overwhelming. I do want to make a point a little bit about the whole idea of sort of what's coming up with resuspended road dust, and make a note that it may not be as simple as just, in my mind at least, tire wear and brake wear. For example, I think we probably be good to be thinking about brake weights, the weights that balance tires that are largely made of lead, and maybe some of those are transitioning out, but that's going to certainly come from the tire, get ground up, and we know that that's a major source of lead off the roadway. Likewise, similar type of thing with the, potentially in the future, we're moving completely to non-combustion, non-tailpipe, but a lot of the metals that are in after treatment technologies are not real healthy and pretty toxic as well. So those, again, things that get bounced around and end up on the road, get resuspended. So I guess to me, it seems to me that it would be good not to ignore those and figure out how that fits in. And I realize that if you talk about all of the road dust, it gets complicated, but the road dust is not just clean dust with brake and tire. These other components are important as well.
Yeah, good points again. Thanks. Appreciate that. Let's see here. Lawrence Beeson.
Yeah, I was wondering if there was any interest in having the prospective contractor also incorporate in their proposal estimated predominant wind patterns in the target area, especially regarding people who generally live upwind versus downwind of their dominant sources of particulates. And if the prospective person incorporated wind patterns, if that would affect their points.
That last part you said would earn points. You mean like in the rubric?
Yeah, in the rubric. If they somehow incorporated who was upwind or downwind from dominant particulate sources, whether it's road or industry, whether that would affect their score.
Okay.
I know wind patterns is challenging, but Loma Linda has done that to some degree.
Yeah, thanks. I think that we were hoping that maybe a modeling component, chemical transport modeling component, which, depending on our resources, we may be able to help support, would sort of capture that, as opposed to doing one-off locations, but kind of getting the model to advec the emissions around.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I see two hands still raised in Zoom. Are those still additional questions? Phil?
Yeah, another thing you had mentioned in the slide, a potential interest in airports. And I had been part of a study about 10, 11 years ago where we were doing sampling at Dulles. And the biggest source of PM 2.5 and across, you were doing it with drum impactors. And so we have size distributions, but it's pretty close across the board, was tire wear off of planes when they land. Much less so that in terms of particulate mass, that was the biggest source we saw at any of the three sites on the Dulles property. Not the tugs, not the direct emissions from the engine exhaust, but the spurt of smoke, white smoke you see every time a plane lands. So if you're really interested in, near airport effects, that may, tire wear may be an important, and we also saw molybdenum. So you're also getting emissions from the bearing grease, high temperature bearing grease.
If you could, if you have any references on that you could send our way, I think that'd be helpful just to make
Sure,
sure.
I'll send them to you, Scott. That we have a separate paper, but there was also a transportation board, National Academy Transportation Board report on that work.
Great, appreciate it. And also appreciate all the oh, I'm sorry, one more here in the room. Please go ahead.
Hey, Ryan Sinclair, Loma Linda University. I was just looking around while everyone was talking, and pretty much tires are microplastics. And from what I know about microplastics, especially in water, there's so many different extraction protocols based on their size, and it's really difficult to get one method that could be effective across lots of different microplastics. I guess, tires are probably predominantly one type of rubber, but there's lots of other plastics nowadays on cars. So just the RFP in general having maybe a little bit more refined targets in terms of metals from, say, the brakes or the tire weights or the rubber or even maybe the plastic parts that are in so many cars now. I think that all those three things are going to have really different methods for detection and also different physiological impacts.
Yeah, great. Appreciate it. Good comment. And so, yeah, a lot of really good feedback. Definitely hearing a theme of we need to focus a little bit. I think what I'm hearing is with all the different thoughts and questions, again, this is a big wide open field, that there's a lot, I think, of productive things that can happen here. We just need to make sure that our study is on point and can have a good deliverable result. So we'll take all this back and that I think will help inform how we move forward with this RFP. So we'll be coming back to the tag as well throughout this process on, where the study is going. Okay. Okay. So with that, and in the interest of time, I want to keep going because we still have a couple of presentations or a couple of agenda items left. And so let's go ahead and keep moving on to the next one now on source apportionment strategies. So Payam, go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Payam Parkveen. I'm the Atmospheric Measurements Manager in the Monitoring and Analysis Division. This is a joint presentation with my colleague, Dr. Mohammad Solat. I'll be going through the presentation slides, but he's been leading a lot of our source apportionment studies and the study design for the MATES as well. So next slide, please. So very quickly, I know the tag members are all familiar with source apportionment. It's a mathematical procedure for identifying and quantifying the contribution from different sources of emissions. And it is mainly based on measurements that is part of the MATES study. Looking at different compounds that we're measuring. Obviously, MATES is focused on air toxics assessment, but we're doing a fairly comprehensive speciation for both particulate matter and gaseous pollutants. The most commonly used model is the PMF analysis. It's a multivariate analysis tool. It's a factor analysis. And that's something we're going to use for the MATE-6. It is the first time that the MATES study is having this source apportionment component to it. So like for this MATES, it's more of an exploratory approach. One of the main objectives of MATES in general is to look at the long-term trends of the air toxics over, for example, every 4 or 5 years when we repeat this type of measurements as part of MATES, we're looking at how these concentration levels change. And source apportionment gives us this opportunity to look at how the source contribution change over time. So it's a very good complement to this study. Next slide, please. So while this is the first time we're doing a source apportionment as part of MATES, we've been involved in some source apportionment studies here at AQMD. So I just wanted to go really quickly over those studies. Next slide, please. So one of these studies was to look at the particulate elements and metals trends and also source apportionment study in city of Paramount. The city of Paramount has many metal processing facilities in a close proximity to each other, and also in a mixed industrial and residential area. Through lots of complaints that were coming in over a decade ago now, we were doing some type of investigation, compliance and enforcement actions, and looking and doing some inspections at these facilities. Over time, it led to sample collection downwind and upwind of a lot of these facilities as potential sources of air toxic metals. We, at some point, I believe we had up to 36 samplers going on. And then later on through this investigation, we added 2 continuous XRF units for continuous measurements of particulate elements and metals at 2 locations to complement this type of investigation we were doing. And then that gave us an opportunity to, look at the long-term trends of these higher time resolution elements and metals information and do a source apportionment study of the particulate metals only in this case. We saw, for example, a very distinct contribution from several different emission types. These include industrial emission sources, resuspended road dust, brake wear, and resuspension of soil. And obviously, this was consistent with some of the similar type of measurements done in the South Coast Air Basin. We were just discussing our plans to have a focus on brake wear and resuspended road dust during this MATES campaign. So obviously, this is something that gives us an idea that the source apportionment, especially focusing on metals, can give us very good information on the contribution of resuspended road dust and brake wear and whatnot. Next slide, please. This is another study that was basically a follow-up to the previous study. It looked at the long-term trends in composition and sources of metals, again in city of Paramount at the same locations. But this time, and because of the COVID-19 lockdown, we had this period of time where we could do a case study, basically, because all of a sudden, because of the lockdown, the contribution of different sources drastically changed. The traffic number decreased. There was already, even before the lockdown, there was a little bit of, declining in the demand for the type of metal processing that was done in this city related to, the aerospace or other industries. But then right after the lockdown, we saw a significant decline in the contribution of a lot of these source categories. I have to mention that beginning in March and April, meteorology was also a factor. It was very stormy, so it is really important to take that into account. However, over a longer period of time, as we tracked not just the concentration, but through the source apportionment, also tracking the changes in the contribution from different emission sources, we saw that the contribution of resuspended soil dust and brake wear reverted back to what it was pre-COVID, whereas the contribution from industrial sources, still there was some increase after a little bit, but they remained lower than what it was, especially much before the COVID. As I mentioned, it was like a very nice case study, typically for looking at how the contribution of different source categories changes over time. These studies have to be done over a very long periods of time, but because of this lockdown, there was a situation where the contribution from different sources may have changed differently and not proportionally to each other. We are in the process of having this published, so the manuscript is not yet available. I'm more than happy to share that as soon as this is published. Next slide, please. And then beyond that, we also have some couple other source apportionment studies coming in. So I just wanted to go through them really quickly. Next slide, please. One of them is again focused on areas in Los Angeles that with a lot of metal processing facilities. In the map and shown with those blue pins, those are the location of the metal processing facilities that have a current permit with South Coast AQMD. There's over 150 of these type of facilities just in these two communities. And then AQMD was awarded an EPA grant to basically develop and to design and develop a multi-metals mobile monitoring platform. We basically use the same XRF unit that we use in our monitoring stations, but we work with the manufacturer to do some modifications and optimize it for higher time resolution measurements. The highest time resolution we could get was 5 minutes, so it's still not perfect for doing mobile monitoring measurements. However, we came up with this very creative way of, first targeting larger areas and, survey those areas at the speed of about 30 miles per hour. And then whenever we see any air pollution hotspots or locations with persistent elevated levels of some of the metals, we would target very smaller areas and repeat those type of surveys at a much lower speed, and also could complement this with doing a stationary measurements downwind of a facility or a potential, source of emission. We did a 1 year of surveys. This was roughly 1 survey day per week for a whole year. The areas we focus for this survey are shown in the map with different colors. Those are different zones. So at each period of time, we would focus only on that zone and do repeated measurements. And also these measurements were complemented by stationary measurements with the XRF units at 2 sites. So obviously this allows us to do a source apportionment study, not just based on the stationary measurements that we did, but also based on the mobile monitoring surveys that we did. Because this gives us an opportunity of, looking at the concentration levels near potential sources in residential areas. We also drove on freeways and major roadways, and in fact saw some of the highest levels that we saw on these major roadways, off ramps and on ramps, an indication of the high contribution of resuspended road dust. Next slide, please. A quite different study that we're doing is in Coachella Valley. This is an environmental justice community where we're working with the community members, doing some measurements to address some of their very specific air pollution concerns and priorities. One of these priorities that was communicated to us by the community members is just the dust in this community, the dust that comes from the surrounding deserts, and also the contribution from the drying Salton Sea and the playa dust. Well, this community actually, we have a lot of dust events in this community. Usually when the wind picks up, but the wind can come from different directions. So like one of our goals here was to determine whether the dust, the composition of dust would be different when it's contributed from different sources of emissions. In order to do that, we're doing a very comprehensive measurement in Mecca, in a site that's actually located in a school. So like it also gives us, a little bit understanding of what the community members, especially sensitive group, are being exposed to. The measurements are quite similar to what we're doing for mates. And this is going to be one of our mate sites as well. So similar measurements are going to be repeated as part of the Mate 6 campaign, so that we can see the trends basically between the measurements done in 2022 to 2023 and then repeated in 2025. We're mainly looking at PM10 speciation because we're looking at dust. And the measurement include PM mass, elements and metals, ions, total carbon, and then by subtraction, because we also have black carbon measurement, we also have an estimated particle bound OC. We're also looking at the morphology of the particles. And the plan is to do a source apportionment of the PM10 to characterize the dust in Mecca. Next slide, please. And then that takes us to MATE 6 study. Next slide. So this is the location of the monitoring stations as part of MATE 6. 3 of them shown in orange are the sites that are new to this MATES campaign. 2 of them are the near road sites, one on 710 and one in by I-60 in Ontario. And then the third new site is Mecca that I was just discussing. The sites indicated in black are similar to the previous MATES, and we're doing 24-hour time integrated sampling with 1 in 6 days sample schedule at all of the sites. We're also complementing that with a lot of continuous air measurements and a little bit more advanced monitors. Next slide, please. So first, starting with time integrated samples, I divided that to 3 different categories. One is particulate matter. We're doing PM2.5 speciation at 6 sites. That includes elements and metals, PM mass, ECOC, and ions. We're doing PM10 speciation at all 10 sites. Obviously, there's a little bit focus on the breakware, resuspended road dust. So we're doing this full speciation at all 10 sites for PM10. It's very similar to PM2.5, but we're also looking at sugars, including levoglucosan. And we're doing a TSP speciation only at 2 sites, looking at metals and hexavalent chromium, which is an air toxic that can contribute to the total cancer risk. We're also doing a speciation of gaseous pollutants at all 10 sites that include volatile organic compounds. It has a fairly, list of many of the VOCs that we discussed in the previous tag, as well as carbonyls. And at 4 of the sites, we're doing semi-volatiles PAHs analysis. Next slide, please. And then these measurements are complemented by high time resolution measurements. Again, for particulate matter, we're doing continuous measurements of PM2.5 and PM10 mass concentration, PM2.5 at 9 of the sites out of 10, and PM10 at 5 of the sites. We have CPCs to measure total particle number concentration at all 10 sites. We're doing elements and metals using the continuous XRF unit at 5 sites. Black carbon measurements using aethalometers. These are 7 wavelength aethalometers at all 10 sites. And then these are complemented by total carbon analysis at 2 of the sites, which also gives us the estimated particle bound OC. And then gaseous measurements, these measurements are complemented by ammonia measurements at 3 sites, and ethylene oxide, which is to be determined, and you will hear a little bit more about that in the next presentation. Next slide, please. So there are the different potential scenarios how to conduct this source apportionment study. One of the things we're planning to do is to run the PMF analysis separately on the time integrated data sets for PM2.5, PM10, and gaseous pollutants, and perhaps even PAHs separately, and to use the continuous data in terms of how to interpret that information. Another approach that we're looking into is to run the PMF on the combined time integrated data sets as well as continuous measurements. And then a little bit more complicated and more exploratory would be to use multilinear engine, which allows us to include all of this information all together. One of the caveats would be limited number of sites have all of the measurements. So like it's something that actually we would love to hear some input from the tag members and come up with, a good approach, a good reasonable approach for mates study. Next slide, please. So generally speaking, again, open for discussion, and we would love to hear any input you may have, but generally really interested to hear, given with the available data and these proposed scenarios, what would be the most effective approach to perform a comprehensive source apportionment study, particularly to support the objectives of the MATES study? And what are the potential challenges or data gaps? And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Payam. So again, we'll open it up for those here in the room. If there's any questions or comments, we'll start with you first. If you have anything right now, or if you want to sit and chew on it a little bit, we'll open it up to Zoom. Go ahead.
And I apologize for not saying my name earlier, Lilia Hawkins, Harvey Mudd College. One question was just if you could remind me how long the measurement period will last. It's starting in early 25 and going how long?
It is for 1 year period.
Okay.
Now, some of these sites are also part of different programs. So like some of the measurements have been ongoing, even between MATES 4 and MATES 5, but obviously it's a lot more limited. The MATES campaign is designed to be a 1 year study.
Okay.
So like the intention is to focus the source apportionment on this 1 year campaign. However, with source apportionment and having the data, there are options to even go back and, fill the gap between the two MATES.
So yeah, thank you. The reason I asked is that when you're doing source apportionment over a long period of time, even a year, the source profiles of the same source can change. And I know that the SOFI package, which is the multilinear engine, has the capability for the multilinear engine. There might be some possibilities to use different software tools to allow some flexibility over time in the shape of the source profiles to account for that. And also other studies have targeted smaller chunks of their data, like spring, summer, or summer, fall, depending on the similarities in the observations, and done source apportionment on smaller periods of time, because you can actually lose out by trying to have one source profile over very different conditions such as weather. That was one comment. And then a question was whether you would co-locate the PM10 and the metals measurements, because it's not at every site, and that might inform some of the roadway emissions and brake and tire wear. Do you know if those are going to be co-located?
All of the 5 sites that will have continuous XRF unit have also PM10.
Okay.
And then we're planning not all 5 XRF units, but up to 4 of them, we're planning to run them with a switching inlet.
Okay.
So like it gives you, an understanding of both PM2.5 and PM10. Again, the caveat is that you only have 30 minutes for each size fraction. So there are challenges with that as well, but it also gives you additional information.
Great, thank you.
Brian Sinclair, Loma Linda University. Thanks for presenting this. I know that, MATES is doing a lot of different things, and it's kind of hard to, give a response to those questions. But I just had a specific comment and a question as well. So as far as the hydrogen sulfide goes, I'm working with another group at 2 scientists, one at UCLA, one at Brown, with a local who was able to post-process some of the data that you sent along from the H2S. I think it's from that site, as well as the one from the Torres Martinez in the Eastern Coachella Valley, in the ECV site. And one of the things that we determined from that, or he did, was that when you look at the exceedances for H2S and the wind direction, it really highlights where the wind is coming from on those exceedance days, because it's different from the predominant wind. And that has some good implications. And I think that that's part of MATES. I think you're going to eventually get to that down the line. And if so, when does that sort of result come out? The other one was just a technical question. What's the limit of detection for your H2S monitor? We're working with one right now that we put out on the Salton Sea, and it has a little bit, not as low as we wanted, limit of detection, but I was just wondering what yours was. I'm pretty sure it's lower than what we have. And then another one, I get this question from a lot of people. You know, working at the Salton Sea, you get a lot of people sending you questions on email, but one of them that I've seen a couple of times, that's just saying it politely, I guess, but is BMAA, one of the toxins from algae. And I don't think that it's in mates, but what would you suggest to people who want to look at that? Because, you know, the ECV has so many different potential contaminants and toxins, pesticides and everything. What about some of these algal toxins? Is this even the correct agency to look into that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's something that, from my understanding, it's not the focus of AQMD, but we have very collaborative work that we're doing with different research institutes, yourself included. So like as part of the measurements we're doing in Coachella Valley, we're also collaborating with UC Riverside. So like they're a little bit more focused on the health study that they're conducting and looking at some of those biomarkers that I'm not fully familiar with. But I see this as a very, very interesting part where we can collaborate with different research institutes. But I don't have the answer to that question myself. In terms of the detection limit for H2S monitors, I don't have the exact number. I believe it's single-digit ppb. Obviously, you know, the human nose is still more sensitive than the monitors that we have. You can still smell the H2S, while some of these monitors are unable to measure. But the standard and the notification system we have in that community is for 30 ppb, and these monitors can measure at a very good accuracy, but at 30 ppb, everyone can smell the H2S at the same time. Yeah. I wanted to also mention H2S is not one of the pollutants measured at part of MATES, but obviously working with the community members in Coachella Valley, one of the main concerns in that community is the H2S, is that rotten egg smell that's coming from the Salton Sea sometimes. It has a seasonal pattern. So as part of the measurements we're doing in that specific community, we've been doing H2S measurements for years now. So like it's a different program from MATES, but it's something that we've been looking into.
You just have it clustered here with MATES.
It was basically, I was just going through the source apportionment, the studies that we're conducting beyond MATES. So like what experience we have, which leads us into adding the source apportionment element to MATES. So that was the study that's part of AB 617, but it's a source apportionment study that we're doing this year.
Quick question, hopefully it's related. Port traffic, does that confound your data at all, especially around the ports when you're trying to localize sources?
Yeah, well, port emissions is something that, first of all, we have a site in Long Beach that can capture some of the emissions coming from the ports. But again, beyond MATES, we also have some very specific studies with the focus on the port emissions. We actually were awarded another EPA grant to build this enhanced PM 2.5 measurements that we're going to do very near Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles. The site will be also very close to the one of the refineries, major refineries, Phillips 66, also close to Terminal Highway. We're doing high time resolution PM 2.5 speciation. We're also doing a size distribution measurement using SMPS and CPC. We have an ACSM. So it's a full speciation of PM 2.5. And one of the major objectives of that specific study to see the contribution of the port emissions. It definitely will have some, source apportionment element to it, but the measurement is not going to start. It actually might align with MATES, but it's not part of the MATES study and campaign. Separate ones.
Great. Yeah, lots of different sources down at the ports, refineries, and the ports themselves are also very diverse, and then just a lot of industry down there. So a lot of confounding factors there.
Yeah, just want to add on that all the emission sources related with ports activity are tracked very closely by our agency in collaboration with California Air Resources Board, and all of them will be reflected in emissions inventory and modeling for the MATES.
Okay, I see a couple hands raised on Zoom. So let's see here. I think Phil Hopke, you have your hand up first.
Yeah, several things. And we've just finished looking at the MATES 4 and 5 data. And we have a paper that we will hopefully have ready to submit in the next week or two, where we can get 8 sources across all of the 10 sites in the previous. You certainly can get a road dust that seems to include things like some of the tire and brake wear, but with the species that you've got available, you're not going to be able to directly get tire and brake wear particles out of that. So it's going to have some sort of expanded analyses in order to get species which are more specific to those particular types of emissions. I want to comment on the previous comment. It's a really bad idea to break up a year's data into subsets. The whole idea of a factor analysis approach is that you have to have sources missing, or at least very low. And you need that seasonal variability to help you resolve sources. You can certainly do it in shorter periods, but that's going to reduce your ability to resolve sources. You'll likely get mixed sources. So yeah, the profiles will look different, but they aren't very realistic. So stick to using all the data. The other thing is that with the time synchronization, the multi-time model, it's tricky to use. And I'll be happy to help, and I'm sure I can rope my colleague at the Ontario Ministry of Environment to help, because he likes doing that. But it will be tricky to set it up, and we'll be happy to help you do that, because it's not trivial.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate those comments. Let's see here. Judith Chow.
Yeah, I was wondering that why you measure level glucose for PM10, not for PM2.5. And if your purpose is to detect, to get some markers for prescribed, any of the wildfire or burning, biomass burning, you might want to consider the same ion chromatographic process can give you 12 carbohydrates, including mannose, galactone, a lot of good markers that you can get in the one process. I think you might want to consider to get more markers for wood smoke. Another thing to consider is that organic acid as well. And the other question I have is that that you have some redundant measurements. What is your plan to reconcile the differences and comparability between the high resolution measurement and your time integrated samples, and that especially for metals and carbon?
So I hopefully can answer your first question. So I think that's a good idea for us to look at some of the other wood smoke markers besides levoglucosan. But we did do an analysis several years ago looking at PM 2.5 and PM2 and PM10, and it turns out all the levoglucosan shows up in the PM 2.5 fraction. So we didn't really see a difference in levoglucosan mass when we look at PM 2.5 size cut versus PM10.
So you're only going to measure PM10 because they show up in PM 2.5?
Yeah, so we.
I see, you're assuming, I see, what do you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, right. So all the mass shows up in the PM 2.5 fraction, but I think it's from a monitoring standpoint, it's easier to sort of standardize sizes, right?
Well, you also have more material, so it's your uncertainty is less, right? The PM 2.5, yeah.
Jason Lowe, lead for the Monitoring Analysis Division. So great question, Judy. So as Scott mentioned, yes, it is a monitoring. As you know, with PM10 versus PM2.5, the amount of material is important. So to kind of reduce the uncertainty with the quantification, it's better to use the PM10.
And then to address your second question, we have done a lot of co-location of this continuous higher time resolution instrumentation with our, reference methods. In most cases, especially for the pollutants and the species that have concentrations that are much higher the detection limits, typically the comparison is very good. For example, the continuous XRF unit has been, tested by EPA as well. And we have done a co-location as part of some of the studies that I mentioned during my presentation. We saw very good, comparison with those species that are actually above detection limit. The main challenge is with some of the air toxic metals, where concentration levels are very close to those detection limits, so we get a lot of non-detects. And obviously, the comparison with our reference method, which is typically 24-hour sampling, and a lot of times we do ICP-MS, which is more sensitive. So for those specific metals, sometimes the comparison is not that great. When it comes to EC analysis and black carbon measurements, continuous measurements, this has been an ongoing conversation, even at EPA level. We're working with UC Davis, who's actually looking at all the improved sites across the nation where this co-location is happening. And there is like a nationwide effort to see how these two methods compare. And there are some cases, especially if there's a contribution from, for example, biomass burning, when there are massive fires going on, that the comparison is not perfect. However, as I mentioned, we have the co-location information, and especially in urban areas, that comparison is much better.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Let's see here. Xiaolang Wang.
Hi, this is Xiaolang Wang from Desert Research Institute. I just want to mention that the port of Los Angeles and the port of Long Beach, they operate quite a few sites at the port and in the neighboring neighborhood that have been collecting filters for probably 20 years. And DRI do have those filters. They only analyze a limited number of chemical species. I wonder if it'll be worthwhile to consider those to leverage the existing sampling for the source apportionment to emphasize the near port community neighborhood.
Absolutely. We welcome any information that can help us, with the interpretation of the information collected during the MATES. The proposed source apportionment campaign will only focus on the measurements done at the 10 sites, but obviously in interpretation of the information, all these type of studies, our own studies and studies by different research institutes is critical in order to, interpret what these different factors mean. Because when it comes to source apportionment, that's just a mathematical method to, group different species that have similar type of variation over time and space. The interpretation of that information is based on our knowledge of the chemical markers for different source emissions and many other factors. So anything that can help us with that is more than welcome.
Okay. Phil, looks like your hand's up again.
Yeah, just Judy reminded me that a good thing would be to modify your IC program so that you're also getting methane sulfonic acid and be able to separate anthropogenic from biogenic sulfate. We've been very successful with that at the two port cities in Canada, in Halifax and Vancouver. And it's very nice to be able to start to see, particularly when you start doing this over time, how the anthropogenic is coming down. Obviously, the biogenic stays relatively constant. And it represents a real limitation on how far you're going to be able to take sulfate down when you're sitting on the coast, on the prevailing wind side of a major ocean.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, I don't see any other hands raised and don't see anybody else here in the room. So again, thank you everybody for that feedback. We're again going to take all this back and chew on it and keep moving forward. So with that, let's go to our next presentation. We're going to change topics now and talk about ethylene oxide, a very important pollutant. And I think Renil, you're teed up to go. Go for it.
Okay, my name is Ranil Damapala. I'm Senior Meteorologist in the Planning Rule Development and Unit under Scott. You can click the next slide. And Nick, going to be, I don't know if Stephen's going to be able to make it in time, but somebody will fill in for him if he doesn't. So a little bit of background, ethylene oxide is a flammable, colorless gas, and it wasn't all that important until a few years ago. Few uses of it, plastics manufacturing, antifreeze, etc. But one of the bigger uses, well, actually those, the manufacturing processes account for the bulk of the ethylene oxide usage, but the direct use of it is in medical equipment sterilizing. Many hospitals and other medical facilities use it to clean their equipment where heat, for instance, is just not conducive. And it has its own toxicity, like direct toxicity, it's an irritant and all that. But in 2016, EPA revised the cancer potency down several fold, 37 times. So at levels that were thought to be okay and relatively harmless, now they became important. So past measurements have typically measured background levels to be around 1 ppb or less, but it did emerge after this EPA 2016 review, which was based on some long-term tracking of, I don't know how many thousands of volunteers, that it was going to be a lot more toxic at much lower levels. But then the challenge became to develop analyzers that were capable of hitting those low minimum detection limits. Click again, please. And okay, so a lot of the manufacturing facilities around the country were immediately targeted for like a whole lot of monitoring campaigns immediately downwind, and they were routinely shown to have in excess of 5 ppb, but these levels quickly dropped off to background levels or below MDLs as you progressed a few hundred meters downwind. Click again. So this study in MATE 6, we're only going to focus on ambient or community exposure monitoring and not the source-oriented monitoring. MATE 6 has not been measured in previous ethylene oxide has not been measured in previous MATES campaigns. So this will be a new species that we're introducing. So establishing a baseline for a new component in a study like this, where continuity is important, is also something that we did have to consider quite substantially. Next click. Another one. Okay, so South Coast AQMD has been in the business of regulating ethylene oxide. We've got, click again, please. Several rules on the book for ETO regulations. There's fence line monitoring requirements of specific facilities. Rule 1405 that was amended recently has some controls and limits the fugitive emissions at these sterilization facilities. And then the AB 2588 program also has various reduction plans that are required if a facility is determined to be high risk for ETO. Next click. Another one. And at a national level, EPA also has several rules and regulations for ETO, and I'm not going to go through the whole list, but there are multiple. This is not just something that is of academic interest. There's plenty of regulatory precedent here, and it is not something that South Coast has just started crafting rules to handle either. So there's a lot of national level rulemaking that's going on, and some of these rules that EPA is also coming up with are also in the process of being updated. Next click. So in terms of the monitoring, we have been conducting the routine 1 in 6 day measurements at two sites, two of our biggest sites at Central LA and Rubidoux since about the middle of 2020. And as of now, about a few weeks ago when I pulled the data, only through the end of December 22 were finalized. Somewhere around April 2021, we switched to a different analytical method, which substantially reduced the minimum detection limit, because before that, before April 2021, so there was about 9 months of samples, we had a detection limit of 0.09 ppb, but now it dropped to about 8 parts per trillion after that switch to the TO15A method. The previous method was TO15. Next click. And I just summarized the data from our two sites here. This is all the data since June 2020, right through the end of 2022. And you're looking at box plots of the monthly distribution at each site, and further broken down by the weekday weekend differences. The MDLs are given as ranges because, as I mentioned before, we had two big, there was a step change in the MDLs. So I'm just showing you the higher and the lower MDLs there, but it changed during the cycle. And one thing that jumps right out there is that, yeah, the summers are generally the higher values, higher concentrations. And whether weekends are higher or weekdays are higher is a mixed bag. It's true in some months and not others. And there's no consistent pattern one site to the next. Next click. And then the dependence on meteorology. On the left, the panel is the temperature dependence. So it's high during the summer, as we saw, and you can see the higher concentrations correlated to higher ambient temperature. Whether that's a actual temperature influencing ET production or some kind of secondary formation, or if the emissions are higher during the summer months through some unrelated processes, we don't know yet. But against relative humidity, there is almost no clear dependence. Next click. So to put the risks in Southern California in perspective, OEHA is still in the process of adopting these new risk factors that EPA had come up with in 2016. But if, next click, but if we use the current and the proposed OEHA risk factors and run all those data that we collected for those 2.5 years through that, then we have, like, the current risk factors show us cancer risk of around 25 to 30 in a million, but we crank it up 37 times, you've got over 1,000 cancers in a million, which are the risks we are likely to see if we monitor ETO at those two sites and the levels remain approximately consistent. Contrast that with the MATES 5 total cancer risk from all sources. You can see that ETO will dominate, assuming everything is approximately the same or even trending downward slightly. Next click. How does our region compare to the rest of the country? And I pulled all the NATS data, the National Ambient National Air Toxics Trend Sites data for ETO from around the country. And I'll just show you a few locations, but next click. There aren't that many sites in the Western US measuring ETO. And this question of the detection limit when they switched, or if they switched to the lower MDL-based silica-coated canister is not always clear from the AQS data. But I'm just using the MDL of 0.12, which is a PPB, which is the assumed national background. And next click. So I'll just show you a couple of sample locations, but I have this for like an interactive map for all those locations, and I can share that if anyone's interested. This one is, I think, in Missouri, and that's what the profile looks like. Again, higher in the spring and the summer months. Weekday, weekend effect is not obvious. Next click. That's in Colorado. Again, you can see the elevated values in the summer. This one may be above MDL a little more often than some of the other sites, but again, it's not very clear what the weekend and the weekday weekend difference is like. Next click. And a more rural site, Rochester, New York. For the most part, maybe below the national MDL, but you can see the higher values in the summer and no obvious trend with the weekday weekend effect. So next click. So if I were to just compare South Coast against either the rest of the country or the Western US, again, using all the, just the one consistent MDL at 0.12, which doesn't necessarily apply equally at all sites. But I don't know whether it's fair to say that South Coast may be lower than even the Western US or the rest of the country on average, or whether those are just artifacts of the MDL issues. Next click. We looked for other community monitoring campaigns around the country. And like I said before, a lot of the monitoring work has been done downwind of specific facilities, but there were several studies where long-term community exposure was assessed. Next click. Previously, I helped do some ETO monitoring in the western part of Washington state, and we had a Picaro continuous ETO analyzer for 2 weeks, and there's a report. You can check that out if you're interested. Next click. For the most part, those boxes were the continuous monitors, and the triangles were the TO15 NATS data. TO15 and not 15A, so presumably higher detection limits. And again, no clear trend. Raymond is right by the Pacific coast, as rural as it gets. And Tacoma is pretty urban. That was a near road site. So kind of the opposite of what you'd expect, where rural is actually higher and little wider distribution than the urban site. And then Lacey is somewhere in between. But no obvious traffic signals. We didn't see anything clearly indicative of industry or traffic or even just, well, anything else that was obvious. This was in the late spring, I think. Next click. So very small rural to urban variation. And the suspicion was that we're talking about ubiquitous sources that are just like regional background, but that's still speculation. Next click. We found this study in Georgia that had like a year and a half of measurements. They did 1 in 6 day monitoring with passive samplers, but this was a TO15 sampling protocol. And next click. So I'm not going to go into all the specifics of the different sites, which ones they represented, which ones were urban and which one rural, but next click. So they did observe this ETO growth in the canisters and near sources like Sterigenics and BD Covington, which is also a medical equipment manufacturer. I'm sorry, a ETO manufacturer. The rural sites were comparable to some of those once they were downwind. And I believe they also found that once the facilities had installed some controls, the levels dropped down to some of those background rural concentration levels. Next click. In Salt Lake, we found a study where they'd done 1 in 3 passive sampling, passive monitoring for like 8 weeks in the summer and some months in the winter, and a total of 17 sites. Next click. Again, so you can see the Sterigenics and the BD Medical, those are ETO manufacturing facilities, and the cluster, the blue cluster of data points in the middle, that was background. So unless you were like right by the facilities, there wasn't a massive difference in the ETO levels measured at close to slightly downwind of a facility versus rural. Summer again was higher than winter, just about in all locations. Next click. Right, another one. Keep going. So there are some ongoing research efforts. EPA recently told us about some near road monitoring they're doing in North Carolina using a continuous ETO analyzer and also using VOC canisters to corroborate their measurements. Tentative conclusions so far is that there's no obvious diurnal trend, at least during the winter months. And there's nothing to suggest that there's like substantial emissions associated with traffic. But those are preliminary conclusions. Next click. And there was this published study out of Toronto, and I really looked for studies outside the country to see if they had been paying attention to this in Europe or even in Australia to see if, for instance, the seasons were reversed, and there just wasn't any that I could find. This was one of the few from outside the country. The one in Toronto found that winter concentrations were very similar to background. And because they didn't see any substantial increase downwind of like heavily trafficked highways, they specifically stuck the analyzer into tailpipes to check for cold start ETO enhancements and didn't see much. Next click. CARB and South Coast are doing some work currently in the planning stages to see how vehicles, different duty cycles are affecting their ETO emissions, if any. Next click. All right, so to summarize this part, next click. Like I said, the summer concentrations are higher. Some sites may be a little higher in the spring, and you can kind of see this at most sites around the country. and weekday weekend effect is just not obvious. At a concentration of 11 ppt, according to the EPA procedures, that would result in 100 in a million cancer risks. But the OEHA procedures are a little more stringent, and you'd get the same 100 in a million cancers at exposure of 7 ppt. So whether or not our concentrations are lower than the Western US or the rest of the country remains to be seen. There is this detection limit problem, which we may be not prone to because we made an adjustment in our methodology, but whether that has been implemented across the board at most other sites, we're not quite sure. Next click. So I think I'm going to ask Jason to chime in on the ETO plan for monitoring plan for May.
Yeah, I think actually Stephen Ditz may have joined us online. So Stephen, if you're online, go ahead and start your slides. If not, then I can fill in.
Yeah, can you hear me fine?
Yep.
So thanks, Renil. So my part here is pretty quick. What I wanted to show everybody here was the same slide you saw in the previous presentation that displays the monitoring sites we intend to use as part of MATES 6. Oh, can you go back one slide? Thanks. One thing I want to point out is that all of these sites, we're going to be doing 1 in 6 24-hour time integrated sampling using TO15A, as Renil has been alluding to characterize ETO for the duration of the study. With that in mind, next click, please. We also purchased, well, 4 of these Aerodyne ETO monitors that'll give us more or less 1 minute ETO data down to our basin background levels. We should see 75 ppt, and if we want to hit lower than that, we could increase the integration time. The application at this point is not entirely known by us, and that's why we're bringing it forth to everybody here. What we're looking to do is either site these at stationary locations or mobile, or perhaps a mixture of the two. For ideas for how we thought about siting these, stationary, we're thinking, near road versus maybe more in a residential area, doing a comparison there, similar to what EPA has already done. But we also want to make sure that we're producing meaningful data and not duplicating efforts or studies that have already been presented. Other areas we thought would be interesting to look at would be sites that might have historically high residential wood burning or potentially high wildfire impact areas, looking at ETO emissions from those types of sources. Another idea we had was doing some sort of basin upwind versus basin downwind, looking at ETO levels as they come in to the basin versus as they exit the basin. On the mobile monitoring front, we were looking at potential short-term campaigns around sites that might show higher elevated values throughout the study. We might find sources that we were previously unaware of if we were to do that, but that's not for sure. And then basically overall just doing surveys, trying to figure out maybe there are other sources contributing to these background concentrations that Renil has been highlighting in these slides. And I think Renil will go into that on the next slide. But basically we're trying to start a discussion here on, how best to craft that part of it. So Renil, back over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is where we're looking for guidance from anyone who is familiar with this topic or has been able to give it some thought. Some of the main sources, other than the obvious sterilizing facilities, what are they, and what is it that contributes to this pretty flat-looking background, which I don't know, somehow seems to be enhanced during the summer? Is that some kind of secondary process, biogenic process, more emissions from some anthropogenic processes? Wildfires have been suggested, and one of the things is that we look at the data across the country and you don't see, like even some of those sites in the south that aren't typically prone to much wildfire smoke still show that trend. So does that rule out wildfires? We don't know that. So yeah, collective wisdom. Any thoughts? Welcome.
Just a quick question. Is there any other airborne chemical whose levels correlate with ETO?
Not that we know of. There have been VOC to ETO measurements like ratios, and yeah, it scales, but does that mean it's just like emitted from a common source, or is it just meteorology driving up the concentrations? We don't know. But I believe that kind of research is also limited.
I was wondering if we need to stick one in the middle of a healthy forest, stick one out in the ocean, just to see what happens. Be curious. All right, interesting.
There is one at a national park in Kentucky, in the middle of a forest, and you still find ETO. So I think it's, Neil highlighted that the real challenge here is, if WEHA finalizes the new risk values somewhere close to what they proposed, this will be the most important pollutant in MAID 6. And diesel suddenly drops down to number 2, probably by a lot. And so that's why I think we're trying to make sure we understand what's going on with this chemical. Where does it come from? What kind of controls are needed? And just really trying to understand that at the same time that a WEHA is looking at the health science of it. So any thoughts that anybody has on, how do we think about sampling for this pollutant? We're all ears. So.
Oh, I'm not familiar with this one, but the analytical chemist in me wants to know if there could be an interfering component that gives you a positive signal. I don't know. Did you mention the measurement technique that's being used for ETOH? Or ETO, rather?
Stephen, do you want to answer? Or do you want me to answer?
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, there are potential interference. There's been a lot of effort between EPA, us, and others really trying to ensure that's not the case. CO15A is the analytical method for ETO and time integrated samples currently. The continuous measurements, there are a couple different methods that are used, such as cavity ring down, and aerodynes is a slightly different optical method. But yeah, we've gone to great lengths to ensure that what interference do exist are not causing these concentrations that we're seeing.
Thanks.
First, a question with the aerodyne with the aerodyne instrument, that you have some preliminary data, and I'm curious how it compares so far with your canister sample measurements.
Or Jason?
Yeah, so the aerodyne units we purchased, we have not actually received as of yet. We did have an aerodyne unit out here, I guess about a year ago or so. And the preliminary data paired fairly well. We put it alongside of our proton transfer time of flight math spec. We saw some good agreeability there. And I think it's been shown by others that at background levels, there is good agreeability between the TILDAS system and the canister-based method.
Yeah, and then just a comment. There was a slide that showed that there was a strong association with temperature, but not with relative humidity. And at least for those measurements where there could be growth in the canisters, it could be that there's a sensitivity to the relative humidity while the canisters are being stored, which will depend only on the dew point outside, at least for their time inside when they're at room temperature, right? So it won't be the ambient relative humidity that's relevant, it will be the dew point. And so it might be interesting to look at that association to see whether there is an association with that.
Certainly. And the interesting thing is that even those campaigns where they used a continuous analyzer without the canisters, they did see that summer increase. Now, I don't know what the RH dependency was there. So the temperature dependency would look similar to what we saw. So that obviously cannot be canister related.
Yeah, and I think in terms of upwind versus downwind, I do think that would be very interesting for sighting the aerodyne instruments in particular. It's always challenging to find a true upwind site. I think it'd be interesting to drive one of those up into the high desert or some area where you can be pretty confident that what you're measuring truly is a background and would not be sensitive to local sources.
I appreciate that. Thanks. I'll go to Zoom, see a couple hands raised. Beth Friedman.
Yeah, hi, I'm Beth Friedman. I'm from Washington State Department of Ecology. I'll just note that in Washington, multiple sites that we've had long-term measurements of, TO15 and TO15A, we just really haven't seen that seasonal dependency and really no indication of co-emissions with traffic-related compounds or other toxics that are measured or wildfires. So we always had the thought of what kind of interferences there could be. And then also on the canister interference topic, I mean, that's a open question, lots to unpack there, especially with the continuous measurements, sometimes not seeing that same effect that Renelle just mentioned. But I know that one of the contract labs that does the analysis did purchase new canisters in order to provide lower concentrations to capture those ambient conditions, but then they still saw, even with the enhanced cleaning methods of those canisters, they still saw over time higher than normal concentrations with those new canisters. So I guess with that, I would suggest co-locating the Aerodyne analyzers with TO15 measurements for longer time periods, maybe to capture those fluctuations associated with temperature that you're seeing. But also, I think it would be useful to consider short-term measurements downwind of known sources in order to ground the measurements and understand what sources could be contributing to ambient concentrations. Thanks.
Good comments. Appreciate it. Thank you. Let's see here. Will Porter.
Hi there. Thanks. Will Porter, UC Riverside. I had a quick question. There was a couple bullet points that noted the absence of a diurnal pattern, and I don't remember seeing a figure showing a diurnal profile. Did I miss that, or was that just not shown and just described?
Not shown in the slides. It's kind of summarized from some of the preliminary research.
But it is a flat diurnal profile. That's what you're seeing?
Relatively.
Interesting. Yeah. So that flat profile is just going up in the summer and coming down in cooler months.
That's correct.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting to me. I can't think of something else that I've seen behave in that particular way. So it's very interesting. I was also curious to note, and this is just kind of an observation, no particular answers here, but it's interesting to me that you see that positive correlation with temperature and no relationship with RH, with RH being inversely correlated, of course, to temperature. And I wonder if there may be some offsetting effects going on there that could be kind of pulled apart as to why it would be that we're not seeing that an inverse relationship with RH that you might expect from a positive correlation with temperature. So it just struck me as curious.
Yeah, that's worth looking into.
Great, appreciate that. Thank you. Tiffany Yelverton.
Oh, good. Hi, Tiffany Yelverton, EPA, Office of Research and Development. So I guess everything that has been suggested is a great idea. Definitely a co-location, considering up and downwind, and also looking across seasons. I without seeing the data that was discussed about seasonal patterns, I can't comment on that. But we have done studies and have presented in as recently as this past November on maybe not a diurnal pattern, but definitely a winter-summer pattern for a comparison between canister measurements and online measurements. So in fact, in the summer months, we saw in comparison to the two measurement techniques that I believe you're planning to use, TO15A and the Aerodyne, a different model of the Aerodyne, I believe, but Aerodyne nonetheless, same technique. We see that in the summer months, there is a different relationship between those measurements for between what is collected in the canister and what is read by the Aerodyne more continuously than we do in the winter. So I can't share screen, but or can I? Ian, is that possible?
We'll open it up for you. Give us 1 sec here.
Oh, cool. Thanks. And you're going to have to pardon my Zoom capabilities. I'm used to Teams, so I will do my best. Since I'm still disabled. But we are seeing the trends, a trend between the canister measurements and the continuous or semi-continuous analyzers for ETO. And we have plans to continue those studies across the seasons to see how, what more we can understand. But it would definitely, I think, be worthwhile to continue these measurements in co-located places across all seasons, because I don't think we can rule that out yet. Can I, let's see. Oh, perhaps I can. Oh, there we go. This is the screen I want to share. Can you see a slide from a presentation?
Not yet.
No, oh, not yet.
Not. Tell you what, it might.
There we go.
It's coming right now.
Yes. Oh, let's see. Okay, I'm sharing. No, I can't see what I'm sharing. That's unfortunate. Okay, so you're seeing the top is real-time and TO15A canister comparison?
Yes.
Okay, so the lower left is the Aerodyne and well, TO15A on the Y and Aerodyne on the x-axis. This was only collected in the summer months because of the utilization of the instrument and other studies. But you can also see in the top right, comparison between TO15A canisters analysis and the aroma, which is entanglement makes that instrument. And then I believe the Picaro was mentioned earlier. And so you can see on the, you can see the Picaro results. I do have to mention that more samples were collected for an extended amount of time for the Picaro because of its availability. And there were gaps in the data, but we feel pretty confident in this. I will still call it preliminary data, but you can see this proportion shift from the winter months to the summer months. So, we don't have a good answer for that yet, but I think that's definitely worth considering in the study moving forward, because we do need to understand those relationships between canister and online instruments. I don't know how to stop sharing. Did that stop?
There you go. Appreciate that. Thanks for letting us know about that. That figure that you just showed, you mentioned that you presented in November. Was that from November, or is that any other reference you can share with us, what you just showed on screen?
Oh, sure. That was, I mean, that the data was not collected in November, but it was shared at the AWMA measurements conference in RTP in November. And yes, I can probably share that. It's been cleared for public use, so.
Okay, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so any other questions in the Zoom or in the room? I don't see anything right now. Appreciate all that feedback that we got so far on ETO. Again, another one that a lot more to come on that one, as it is an emerging, like so many things, emerging science. So with that, I do want to open up. There have been some questions that have come through for public comment on the Q&A. There's been some questions that we've been responding to, some of those live in the Zoom itself. But I also want to open this up right now to any of the attendees. If you had any questions on any of the topics that we've covered so far in this meeting, whether on brake and tire wear, source apportionment, ethylene oxide, please raise your hand and would love to get your thoughts or questions. So I see first hand that's raised, Tara Yakovich. You want to go ahead?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Tara. I've worked on some of the studies of ethylene oxide cited, and I work for the instrument manufacturer that makes the Tildus. And can you hear me?
Go ahead. Go ahead. We hear you.
Sure. So my comments related to that, I love the idea of citing upwind and downwind, as well as the citing next to canister methods, because that intercomparison is very important. And I think there's a lot that's still unknown. I did want to mention that we did a short-term study in California with the Tildus analyzer, and we did see daily variation in ethylene oxide. I'm not going to call it diurnal because it was not correlated to the ozone concentration. So we believe that the spikes we were seeing were due to transport from point sources. And one detail there is on 2 days, there was not as strong of a transport spike, but we observed a small amount of correlated ethylene oxide to ozone to the tune of 0.3 ppt per ppb of ozone. So I think there's a lot of research to be done on kind of the surface chemistry and the photochemistry of this species, but we can't lose sight of the point sources here.
Thanks. I think one of the things that Renal touched on a little bit, we've obviously done a lot of our own monitoring and have a lot of our data online. We definitely see a very strong signal from certain kinds of stationary sources, but that drops very quickly from the data that we have pretty consistently, that we see a very strong bullseye, but it drops down to background levels within a few blocks. But there definitely is that stationary source signal in that near region. But definitely appreciate you raising what you found so far. I see another hand raised. I think it's Dr. Eng.
Hello, can anybody?
Yes,
Hello?
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to just make a comment on ethylene oxide just for a moment. Ethylene reacts with ozone, but it breaks up ethylene. But singlet oxygen, just O1 in the atmosphere, forms ethylene oxide readily on photosensitizers, which are all sorts of catalytic surfaces everywhere. So you might try to do a correlation of this broad ethylene oxide you see with O1 in the atmosphere. Comment one. Comment two, I sent you a couple of pages. I'm sure you got it, so you can read through that about some of my ideas, some of it on PAH and some of it on this brake and tire wear. My biggest concern about brake and tire wear is those agglomerated big fat particles. And so I think that if they measure it, are you going to just scoop up stuff from the road, or are you going to put a pan out there? And so my recommendation is that if you scoop up stuff from the road, that you also have an elevated platform that you let dust settle naturally, and you'll collect some of the finer stuff and you might get a different reading. Lastly, that because do you have a study in road dust? Because you said we're taking road dust out of this other thing. Do you study the carcinogenicity of road dust by itself?
So I think for the second question on the carcinogenicity of road dust itself. So road dust, it could have various compounds that are in there that are carcinogenic, or that OEHA has cancer potency values for, and so those could be a component of road dust. But then a single road dust as a family, does it have its own cancer potency value? I'm not aware of that either from OEHA or any other health agency, but it's certainly possible that individual compounds within it could be carcinogenic. But I think one of the things that mentioned very beginning of this meeting was typically our studies for mates have not really looked at how to establish the toxicity of a compound or the toxicity of a pollutant. It's more relying on the other expert agencies that do that, taking that research and then applying it and seeing the exposure.
Right. But I guess my comment though is that if you separate out the road dust, if you measure what's in that road dust, then you can not do your own research, but then say, oh, has these carcinogenic components. Because what I'm concerned about is that your brake wear and tire, those are going to de-agglomerate, and they might actually disintegrate over time and form all those little particles adhering to those agglomerates might become part of your road dust. So if you take your agglomerated brake wear particles and you chop them up and analyze what all those other components are made out of, you might be able to say, oh yeah, well, some of it is all these ceramics which become road dust, et cetera. I think that might be an important part of what how you analyze a big fat tire wear particle. So those were my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate you making those. I see another hand raised. Joe Hauer.
Thanks, Ian. Joe Hauer with Ramble, and also, as some of you know, working with Sterigenics. There's been a lot of discussion on ethylene oxide. A lot of the sort of potential other sources have all been, or mostly been, combustion sources, and I guess I will just say that matches the research that we've done. Most of the combustion sources have some amount of ethylene oxide coming out of them. And I also wonder, and at least I haven't worked at it much, but I'm wondering if part of the reason that the ethylene oxide concentrations drop off so quickly, and in fact seem to drop off faster than just the dispersion would suggest, is if it's just so reactive that it's disappearing rather than just dispersing, and whether that would be part of the study is to look at the reactivity in the atmosphere. That's all I have. Thanks.
Interesting comment. Appreciate that. I don't know if we have any plans for that, but it's an interesting thought. Okay. I don't see any other hands raised right now. So I think with that, I'm not sure, I don't see actually on our agenda, we don't have any next steps. I don't think we've planned our next tag meeting yet, but we do really value all the feedback we've gotten, all the topics. Really appreciate everybody joining in person, online. And if there's any follow-up anybody wants, feel free to reach out to us. And I'm sure we'll be reaching out on targeted subjects as well. So again, thank you everybody for joining us today. Thanks everybody for pulling this together, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.